Our reading for today comes from Amos chapter 8. Now, Amos is only about 9 chapters long, and the end of Amos, chapters 7 through 9, are this series of prophetic visions that he has. But I'll just tell you that the whole of the book of Amos is pretty bleak. It basically is this critique of the ways that, the ways that following God have been perverted. And so we'll hear now Amos chapter 8, 4 through 6, and 11 through 14. Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring to ruin the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over so that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath so that we may offer wheat for sale? We will make the FF smaller, so that's a weight measurement, and the shekel heavier, and practice deceit with false balances, buying the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, and selling the sweepings of the wheat. The time is surely coming, says the Lord God, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine of bread or a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. They shall wander from sea to sea, and from north to east they shall run to and fro, seeking the word of the Lord, but they shall not find it. On that day the beautiful young women and the young men shall faint for thirst. Those who swear by Ashima of Samaria and say, as your God lives, O Dan, and as the way of Beersheba lives, they shall fall and never rise again. The word of Amos to the people of God. Now, I'm not gonna mix it up for you. Amos's message is really clear. This is the end. It's over, people. Party over. Amos is one of the first prophets. They actually think, scholars believe that the book of Amos was the first prophetic book to be written. It's after the northern and southern kingdoms had divided. But it's the beginning of the tradition of prophetic literature. So all of the folks that come after, like Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah, are actually responding in a certain sense to Amos. And what's interesting about this is all of the rest of them have this message of resurrection after death. You'll find that in little snippets in Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that something comes after. Remember that the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom, and the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom, and the people were taken away into exile in Babylon. And many of the promises in Isaiah, and also the promises in Jeremiah, are that afterwards we'll get to come back. Afterwards we'll re-inherit the land. Well, that stuff's not really there in Amos. This whole concept of resurrection isn't there. The exile is very much there. And this is in the 8th century BCE, much before any of this happened. In fact, we're pretty certain that Amos wrote this before it all happened because he predicted that the king at the time was going to die by the sword, and we know that he didn't. The exile didn't happen for another almost 150 years after Amos's prophecy, which is a good sign that probably this is really what he said, and this really was his message. It didn't get redacted out to be consistent with the historical message that we find at other places in the Hebrew Bible. And what Amos's consistent message throughout is that God is an advocate for the oppressed. That's who God is. That's God's primary identity. And what I love about Amos and about all the prophetic literature is it all draws back to the story of Exodus. It all draws back to the story of when we, the people, were enslaved in Egypt, when we were oppressed, and God came and intervened in history to free us. But Amos turns a lot of these tropes throughout his book. You know, the coming of the day of the Lord, before the book of Amos was written, before the prophetic literature was written, that was about when God was going to intervene in history to save us, to help us win. We always prayed to God before we went out to battle and made sure God was on our side. There was always a prophet at the right hand of the king who would go out and say, God has blessed this battle and ordained this victory. The day of the Lord is coming. Now when you read prophetic literature, you're like, oh, you don't want the day of the Lord to come, because the day of the Lord in Amos and subsequently is the day of comeuppance, the day of consequences, the day when we realize, oh, well, we sure said God was on our side, but we didn't really check with God first, right? And there's two words that are really critical for for Amos. And they're critical for all the prophets. Again, Amos set the standard for prophetic literature. And the two words are righteousness and justice. Now in English, when we use the word righteousness, we usually add the word self to the front of it. And that's a good description of the problem of the concept of righteousness. And also, it deeply shows us how we don't understand biblical righteousness. Because in the Bible, the Hebrew word that's translated righteousness means to be in right relationship. And as the video that we watched before worship this morning talks about, it's about being in right relationship regardless of the status of the person you're in relationship with. That their status, their wealth, their resources, their position within the system should not impact how you are with them. Because they're a person. But more than that, because all of you are under the one God. And we were slaves in Egypt. This is a recurring message throughout the Hebrew Bible to remind us that wherever we are right now is not a consequence of our own exceptionalism. It's a consequence of God's providence intervening in our life again and again and again. And one of the reasons the prophets remind us of that and go back to the Exodus story is they want to do exactly what your mom was telling you, Tina. They want to say, you are no better and no worse than every other person. You are all people. When you talked about your mom being a saint, Robert, but also very much a human, right? That complexity, that nuance. So we're resisting idolatry by letting people be complicated, by letting them be problematic sometimes, by letting them fail occasionally or betray us or hurt us. We're letting them be human. We're not making them into something other than human, something to replace God. And Amos is saying, you guys are screwing this up. You're not in right relationship, and it's obvious. I can just look at society and just see how obvious it is. And for the prophets, justice is the practices that correct injustice. Justice is not a state of being, it's a set of behaviors that address the ways that inequity inherently creeps into systems. That the assumption is that if you build a system, an institution, it's going to become self-serving, and we all know this. Right? Think about the nonprofit industrial complex. Think about how often nonprofits work just to sustain themselves. How often they spend their resources and their energy to make sure they have enough money to keep existing, and the mission sometimes becomes secondary to the existence of the institution. Justice is about actively creating practices to correct for that. Y'all, Amos is saying that the way that the people in the Northern Kingdom are living is broken. And y'all, I am here to tell you that the way that we are living is broken. And I want to give you some stats. Can you go to the next slide, please? This is what the distribution of wealth looks like in America in 2022. The top 10% of households control 60% of the nation's wealth. The bottom half of households control about 6% of the nation's wealth. And in the past 60 years, America witnessed a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class to the wealthiest families. You can go to the next slide. This is what it looked like in 1963. In 1963, the wealthiest families had 36 times the wealth of families in the middle. By 2022, they had 71 times the wealth of families in the middle. Between 1963 and 2022, families near the bottom of the wealth distribution, those at the 10th percentile, went from having $23 in debt to $450 in wealth. So everyone, and it's true, over the last 50 years, wealth has increased. The bottom 10% from negative 23 to 450. Those in the middle, the 50th percentile, they quadrupled their wealth. Those near the top, in the 90th percentile, saw their wealth increase more than sixfold. But the wealthiest families, can you go back one? The wealthiest families, those wealthier than the 99% of all families, saw their wealth increase more than sevenfold, from 1.8 million in 1963 to 13.6 million in 2022. Federal tax subsidies disproportionately benefit the top 40% of people. In fact, over 80% of the benefits of the mortgage interest deductions, property tax deductions, and retirement savings incentives hit only the top earners in our country. 80% of those benefits hit the top 40% of owners in our society. Hit the next slide. After that. And this is deeply, deeply integrated into the racial economics of our country. Disparities in income, retirement savings, and emergency savings impact wealth accumulation. This is a graph about average family wealth by race and ethnicity over time from 1963 to 2022. You see how everyone's increasing some. All boats rise, that philosophy. Well, some boats are a bit more buoyant than others. Home ownership is one particular example. Over 70% of white families are able to own a home in 2022. It is below 45% of black families in 2022. This is why what we're doing with this land is so critical, because these realities aren't going to go away. We can't just start from zero. Go ahead, let's just to the next slide. I won't leave this up forever. Oh, I was supposed to add another slide. Go back 3, 2, 1, there. Let's stay there. Amos is looking at the northern kingdom and he's saying the ways that we've been practicing, the ways that we've been doing this, the ways that we've been organizing have produced outcomes that are not correctable. It's over. This is the end. This must end. The word of the Lord that came to Amos was a word of collapse, not a word of hope. The commentator I was reading said that little addendum at the end of chapter 9 that gives a glimmer of hope in the rebuild, they're pretty sure that somebody added that because they weren't real comfortable with the thing ending with collapse. It's just like Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, the very end of it. It ends at verse 8, but somebody was like, but then people saw Jesus later. Then he was out there, because it ends with, the tomb was empty, and the women went home because they were terrified, and they told no one. End of gospel. And people are like, I don't like that a lot. Can we have more? I want to tell you about the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, right? Pope Leo XIV is an American dude. And I don't know if you have learned a little bit about his background, but his maternal grandparents, his maternal grandfather actually came from Santo Domingo, which is, it was listed as Haiti on the documents, but it would now be, what's the other half of Haiti? Dominican Republic. And he got married to another woman who was from, I believe it was Latin America, I'm trying to remember. But on the census documents, they were listed as black, and they lived in New Orleans. But they moved. This is his maternal grandparents, so his mom's parents. But when his mom was 6, they moved to Chicago. And on the census in Chicago, their family was listed as white. And his mom identified as white, and his mom's family identified as white, and they didn't talk about their life in New Orleans much. And so then he's raised in the south side of Chicago as a white person. Why? Well, that's not hard to figure out. Coming from the South, experience of racial apartheid in this country, moving to a big city, get to change your identity. What are you going to change it to? White. Why? Because it gives you what? All kinds of shit, right? Access to resources and jobs, access to home loans. I mean, like, schools, like, you name it, right? You got it. It's just a gatekeeping mechanism to power and resources and security, and that's what whiteness always was. Whiteness was always a way to create some security. And our nation has been complicit with the becoming of whiteness. And it's generationally impacted us, so much so that now people in America don't know how to talk about whiteness. We don't know what whiteness is. We think white is an ethnicity. Tell me about what white food is. Tell me about white holidays. Like, tell me about the history of white people separate from the reality of colonization, separate from the reality of racial dominance, separate from the reality of genocide and slavery. There isn't one, because whiteness isn't an ethnicity. It's not a history, except the history of power. But we don't understand that as a nation. We still haven't figured out how to tell this story. And so when Amos comes to the northern kingdom, he's trying to tell them how to see what's been happening that they can't see. And the problem about a prophetic word is so often we take it personally and we react. We get anxious. How many of you, when you saw that graph, were like, ooh, and you got a little bit like, not my grandparents. It's okay, you don't have to admit it to me, but I know that that is such a huge part of our encountering this reality of reading a prophetic word about the history and legacy and current realities of America, is it makes us so anxious because we take it so personally. But Amos's word wasn't to one person. He didn't even write to the king. In fact, the king was like, you gotta stop saying this stuff, it's making people uncomfortable. And he didn't clap back to the king, he just said, this is what the Lord has to say. It's over. This is no good. And it cannot stand in the sight of a just God. And so the question for us today, especially as people of faith, is if you know you live in a society that is inherently unjust, and the word of the Lord has come unto you and said, this has to come apart. This can't stand. What do you do? How do you live after you've received such a word? See, Amos was just a dresser of sycamore trees and a shepherd in the southern kingdom of Judah, but the word came to him and he knew he needed to go and say the thing. Now, I don't know what to do with the fact that some people out there will only change their behavior because of their fear of punishment. I don't know what to do with that, but I know it's true. Y'all know it's true too. That demonstrating we're one people, demonstrating that care for the poor is care for everyone, demonstrating that investing money in SNAP and TANF actually benefits the economy, they're not going to get there with you. Some people are only going to stop hurting people because there's a force greater than them that intervenes to stop them. In fact, the history of the world of national politics, when you look at genocide studies, there has never been a genocide that ended without a force from outside intervening. Never. It has always required military intervention, violent, dominating force to stop a genocide. I don't know what to do with that, but it's true. And pretending that it isn't true and pretending that that isn't important only makes us naive. Now, when you talk about the end of the world, it gets a little dicey, because the real question is, whose end? The end of what exactly? And this doesn't get more clear when we start talking about climate change. Because when we talk about climate change, everybody talks about it in these apocalyptic terms, the end of the world. Well, there's a lot of things that can live in a lot hotter, drier places than we can. The end of whose world? Our world. When we start talking about climate change, what we really need to be talking about is the fact that we're about to have major, massive migratory shifts in human population over the next 50 years. And our civilizations, our governments, our institutions are going to have profound stresses on them because people aren't going to be able to live where they used to live. And they're going to be coming to places where people can. This is the next paradigm shift in the next 50 years because we are a global reality. We are a global economy. All this nativism stuff, you can see that they know what's coming and they're preparing for it. the thing that I think I've come to most in my work on racism, which I'm not talking about anymore, I'm talking about white supremacy, because I think racism is a distraction from those issues that we saw in those graphs. Those graphs aren't about racism, they're about white supremacy. They're about control of access to resources and power. That's what they're really about. Racism is about interpersonal stuff that doesn't impact. When you change that, it doesn't change those graphs. It doesn't change the way that that stuff works. The thing I've learned about working with people and talking about issues of whiteness and white supremacy is we have to figure out how to keep seeing the thing. We have to figure out how to have the faith to face the real reality that exists in the world and not turn away. And not take it personally, not make it about us, but recognize that we are inheritors of an unjust system that has been running its script for over 250 years. That where we're at now is the logical outcome of the intention of the architects of America. And it has only changed because people have looked at it and said, like Amos did, this is wrong, this is unjust, this is not the interest of God, this is not the will of God, and have pushed back. All men are created equal wasn't about all men. I mean, it was definitely about men, right? But, you know, Plessy v. Ferguson, right? Like these court cases, the Dred Scott decision, were about saying, you're not one of them. And the institutions and the structures of power have consistently reinforced that we were headed here. The goal was to get here. This was the point. So what are we going to do with that? I'm not going to tell you what to do with it, because I don't know what to do with it, but what I do know is that we need to be able to say that and not have it impinge upon our personal dignity or morality, but just say, this is how it is. You know, like Amos didn't promise resurrection because he needed people to face the reality of impending crisis. And he called it way before it happened, which is almost amazing, right? That he had the prophetic vision, just like W.B. Du Bois had the prophetic vision to say, this is where this is headed, guys. James Baldwin, this is where this is headed, guys. Do you recognize? Can you see yet? The only way we're going to find a way through into something that looks remotely like the kingdom of God is if we can continue to see the world as it is and not pretend that it's a different world. I think about the role of our mothers and those people that mothered us, those people that implanted the word in us. Because Amos is here saying, there's coming a time where there will be a famine, not for bread and not thirst for water, but for hearing the word of the Lord. Are we people who have the word in us so that we can face reality and look around on a society that does not speak the word of truth, of justice, of mercy, of compassion, of inclusion, and we don't need the world to speak it because we have it in us so that we can stand and face the world as it is and say to God, here I am, Lord, use me. This is the call for us in the 21st century. Can we just have the faith to face reality? This is what Amos wanted for